And now I just ask our panelists, our final panelist, Julia Black, who is from IOM, and to just join us. I just asked somebody in the technical room to check. Somebody needs to be admitted, then it's flashing on my screen. Just to introduce Julia. Julia Black is based at IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center, GMDAC, which is in Berlin, where she coordinates the Missing Migrants Project. And her work deals with data collection and identification of missing migrants worldwide. She has also co-edited IOM's report on migrant deaths and identifications called Fatal Journeys, Volume 3, and has been a co-author on several other publications that are done by IOM. Most particularly, there's one that was just released last week that looked particularly at Africa, the Africa Migration Report, as it is known, looking at irregular migration. So you can look up some of the work that Julia has done in terms of bringing out aspects of her work. And this, and before joining IOM, Julia ran a local nonprofit in San Francisco Bay Area, and she also holds a master in international affairs from the Hertie School of Governance and a Bachelor of Arts in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California. And Julia, just to bring you on here, I looked at a tweet that you had just shared that talked about, you know, actually it was from your LinkedIn, where you said every death we record was a person. And if you would allow me to extend it here, I would say it's the person with a family. So I was just wondering, you know, as you come on to give us your deliberations, or rather to give us what your reflections are in terms of the, you know, giving us a scope of what the project is, but going a bit beyond in understanding how, you know, IOM is leading the various actors, not just at the government level, but let's say, you know, also within the UN system, and working together with civil society on how we're tackling this objective Objective 8, you know, how do we really see this sentiment, for instance, that you have expressed in your work through IOM? And I will come back to you with some other questions. So over to you, Julia. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thanks very much, Patty, for the invitation and the lovely introduction, and to all the other speakers. It's funny, you know, I've been working on this topic now for 5 years, and you think you know everyone, and there's always someone new in one of these discussions. So it's really great. I've actually been a little bit extra and prepared some slides. So I'm just quickly sharing my screen. I hope you can all see. So yes, so just very briefly, and thank you, Patty, as well, for this good question about what we're doing. So IOM's Missing Migrants Project has been around since 2014. It began collecting the data, which you can see here, basically in response to the Lampedusa shipwrecks in October 2013, which claimed, you know, hundreds of lives. But it is a global database. It's open access, although of course anonymized. And one thing that's relatively recent, and is exactly to the point that you were mentioning, is that we're now trying to understand better what the families of these missing migrants are really doing and what they need. And of course, as Patty mentioned, we write a lot of reports, you know, based on our data and kind of general thematic issues around this issue. So why is IOM doing this? First and foremost, the Missing Migrants Project, the data set, is really an advocacy tool. The issues about the invisibility of these people, I think, has been touched on throughout this presentation. Policy, in addition to, of course, Objective 8 that we're here to talk about today, there is also Sustainable Development Goal 10.7, on safe migration, and the Missing Migrants Project dataset was actually adopted this year as SDG Indicator 10.7.3. We also do, on a more ad hoc basis, provide support for operational planning. So that's, you know, of course, going to be providing information on the deaths in specific areas or on specific routes. And unfortunately, also on a very ad hoc basis, we receive requests from family members who haven't been able to find a missing loved one. So we're helping with that in whatever way that we can. So one thing that's really important to mention, and I think it hasn't really been discussed much, is how does one define a missing migrant? So for the Missing Migrants Project data set, we're really looking at deaths or sort of presumed deaths, so like disappearances at sea. And the idea there is that this is really identifying the risks of the migratory movements on these irregular migrant routes. That does mean that there are many other sort of missing or deceased migrants who are not included in our data sets. So this is going to be deaths in immigration detention facilities, refugee centers, and so on. There are going to be many deaths linked to labor migration, or, for example, I myself am a labor migrant here in Germany. If I die, I'm not going to be contained in the Missing Migrants Project data set. We also simply don't have the capacity to track, internal migrant or internal displacement deaths. And then, much more broadly, we do not include missing persons reports where we don't know if there was, in fact, a death. To my knowledge, there really isn't anyone who has a global picture of how many missing persons reports linked to migration are filed in a given year. As you can imagine, working on any topic linked to irregular migration, data on this is really, really challenging. This is very much linked to this issue of invisibility, where people are intentionally choosing routes to evade detection. This also means that people might be afraid to report a death or a disappearance. It, of course, the remote routes that people take, as Eddie very aptly highlighted, in the desert or overseas, as Filippo was talking about, is going to lead to a vast undercount of migrant deaths. And yeah, absolutely, these deaths in lakes or sea or whatever means that many, many people are just disappearing without a trace. So I hope you guys can see this. It's getting a bit blocked by this Zoom interface, but our methodology, just very briefly, because there really aren't any government actors at a federal level, at least, who are collecting comprehensive data on this topic, we really rely on 5 main sources of data. So this is, the project is and has always been based a lot on news media reporting. We always try to verify this, whether that's from, NGOs, other eyewitnesses, other UN agencies, or IOM's offices itself. And ideally, we're able to verify this with a government actor, but this is not always possible. This is then fed into an internal database. We try to verify, we try to reach out to any actor who we think might be relevant. And then it's published. We update the data twice a week, so it's very timely. Just super briefly, I hope you guys can see this. You can see here the data that we have collected, and very obviously, the number of deaths we've recorded in the Mediterranean is dominant, but it is absolutely a global issue. There's really no region of the world where we haven't recorded a death, except for, Antarctica. One of the things that's really important to stress when talking about data on migrant deaths, though, is how biased it can be, and especially when you have kind of narratives of a migration crisis, such as you get in the Mediterranean, but also you can see this very clearly in Asia in 2014, 2015. This was when there was a big exodus of Rohingya refugees, many of whom became stranded, very, all over the news off the coast of Southeast Asian countries, and many of these died. These people died, and because this was so high profile, because there was this narrative of a crisis, we have large numbers of deaths recorded. Now, the Rohingya crisis is really not over. In fact, I would say it's as bad, if not worse, as it was then. But these people are now taking, less high profile routes. They're going over land to Bangladesh or overland smuggling routes to Thailand and so on. And so that just makes it much, much harder to really capture the extent of this issue. So yes, as I mentioned, a lot remains unknown, especially in remote areas where there's, 1 or 2 people dying. As Filippo mentioned, often the only, kind of source of data we have for this is someone who witnessed that, and they might not be willing to talk to us or to talk to the authorities. We do really have, and especially in the last year, a crisis of what we call invisible shipwrecks, where boats are really disappearing without a trace, without any survivors. And it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to, first of all, know that this happened, and second of all, get an estimate of, how many, let alone who was on board. Heavily militarized borders, we get a lot of anecdotal reports about people being killed. You might have seen the Human Rights Watch report about the Ethiopian migrants in Yemen who were killed in April. It's very hard to verify those reports. And then really vitally, for the people most impacted, who are the families and communities left behind by these migrants, we have so few details about who these people are who die. So in order to kind of in some way address this, this year we're piloting a research project, basically trying to find families who are searching for missing migrants who have disappeared, somewhere in the central and western Mediterranean routes. One of the things that we're trying to do with this project is to counter the narrative that these families are all going to be in, like underdeveloped countries, very poor and destitute. In fact, the research we've done, which is being carried out in Ghana, Ethiopia, Spain, and UK, all of which are, some variety of countries of origin, transit, and destination. There are families in all of these countries who have lost someone. And the results from this will all be released later this year and up to March next year. But this is a little bit of a sneak preview. The idea, is of course to raise awareness about the families impacted. Somehow this often is really absent from discussions about this, especially, with policymakers, and to really listen to these families and understand what they need, and then take what they're telling us and, give this to the policymakers to say, you do need to take action in this way. Unfortunately, the key findings, I have to say, have been really, really heartbreaking across all countries, really. The families are overwhelmingly the ones who are pushing this by any and all means available. And this is despite the fact that many of them are themselves in really precarious situations. Some of the research we did in Spain was in, the farms in southern Spain, where many of these people are kind of irregular migrant workers, farm workers. Across the board, really, there are no centralized government actors who are really working on this issue. I think the Italian Special Commissioner would be like the exclusive exception to this that I'm aware of. And then one thing, just super briefly, which was really, really difficult for me as a woman, is to hear how badly impacted the women, especially wives of migrants who have gone missing, have been, really cast out, not by the governments, or not just by the governments, but also very often by their communities that they're living in. So what are we trying to do? On the data side, we're doing some very cool high-tech stuff using an assisted machine learning tool and natural language processing to capture more media results on this topic. We now have a system of regional monitors who are kind of mapping out relevant actors and trying to, collect data, especially from smaller NGOs that we might not be aware of. Yes, we are planning to put out these recommendations and really have a strong communications campaign with this, because I think very often, recommendations from big UN or other big organizations are put out and just kind of into the vast abyss of, all of the reports that are published. And of course, I think everyone, who's presented here faces the challenge of fundraising. Our fundraising actually expires at the end of the year, so we're constantly kind of fighting for funds to continue the project, but also we really hope to expand and improve. So that's that from me. Yes, so thanks very much. And again, I know many of you presenting, and I've also seen quite a lot of you in the participants list who I've met, at least virtually. But like I said, we're always looking for more contacts working on this issue. So please, my email was in the slide and I can put it in the chat. Please reach out to me if you're doing relevant work. Thank you.
Julia, thank you for that presentation on the IOM project. And I'm just made to think that, as you are, you're saying you'll be going out to do a piece, I guess, on recommendations that would go to governments. And we've also heard that ICRC has had these recommendations that have been sitting out there since June 2020. And I guess, other actors in the stage as well. How do all these things really come together? And I sort of liked what you said about, really families are the ones that are sitting, and I'm meant to think that, in some cases it's also families that have been left behind, mainly women and children who've been left behind by most of these migrants that have gone out to seek work, in the case of where men are the ones that have been the breadwinners. So they are the ones trying to get a bit more information, to get a bit more clarity. Why aren't governments doing a little bit more? Because these are their citizens who remain unaccounted for, who would be interesting as remittance senders in this case. So why are we not really seeing this level of engagement? And what would you say then is really the stumbling block in terms of international cooperation? So from IOM's side, together with other actors in the room, but then together collectively in pushing governments to say, this you signed up to in the GCM, and it's not just a placeholder because we needed to say something about missing migrants. But, we went a step further and said that we actually want to deal with what's happening with their families. So do you just want to come in, and then I will ask Filippo as well to just answer on the same question, sort of giving this question back to Filippo and saying, why are we not working together in this space? If we, we can be on the same webinars, why are we not working together? Or where are we working together?
Absolutely. No, I think this issue of getting states to buy into, taking some steps to improve this is really the heart of it, right? There shouldn't need to be any NGOs doing search and rescue anywhere in the world, because that's actually a state's obligation. In my view, of course, countries of destination are going to be resistant to anything that's going to promote more migration. That's just the reality of the world. What we have found with this families research, for example, is that other kinds of countries are just not really aware that this is a problem. So we actually had a great consultation with some stakeholders from the Ethiopian government a few weeks ago. They're extremely keen to really build up the capacity within their agencies to work on this issue, but it's a question of capacity. It's a question of, prioritization. How many other issues do these countries face? And is this the most pressing one? And, ultimately it's really, like it or not, many of these countries are receiving a lot of funds from governments which are not into this idea. And I think one thing I have noticed actually when looking, I just wrote a page about GCM Objective 8. It's one of the few objectives actually where human rights is not mentioned explicitly. And I do wonder, to what degree is that a reflection of states' lack of acknowledgement that this is a human rights issue?